Quite frankly, I think the Conservative movement tried to get along with the CBC as if they would sometime all of a sudden start liking them or something. Apparently that's not working out very well, and I think that's another thing that obviously Maxime Bernay learned from that was there wasn't much point trying to make friends with them. There's lots of other people in the world you're quite happy to make friends with, and one of them that we've been lucky enough to make friends with is, well, Candice Malcolm in True North and her colleague Andrew Lawton, who had to go to court to get like a politician in our country had to go to court to get to cover an election. Who would have thought that that could possibly happen? And I don't know how it happened. I don't know quite how you got it turned around, but that's why you're here, is to tell us all that. So Andrew's going to talk about fake news and real Canadians. So please welcome a real Canadian to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for that warm welcome. Thank you to Danny and the organizers. And I've got to say in particular, as this is a conference that I know is exploring independence, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to make my first ever address to a nation. So thank you for that. And just on a personal note, please don't boo this, because I have an Albertan sensibility. I am an Ontarian, so I have to say thank you for my health care, for my roads, for my education, just basically anything I've ever had. I have to thank the good people of Alberta for that. Yes, 3 applauding people from Ontario who now live in Alberta, probably. If you were at all familiar with the story that Danny just shared a snippet of, the ordeal that I and my outlet, the True North Centre for Public Policy, had to go through in the election, you'll know how exciting an opportunity it is for me to actually be invited somewhere and to actually be allowed in to somewhere. I'm not used to this. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I guess the upside is, this being Red Deer, I have the comforting fact that I'm in a part of the country that the Liberals have never heard of and have no idea where it is. So I'm safe at least for the next 20 minutes as I go through what Danny so kindly introduced as being a talk on real Canadians and fake news. Now, these are 2 very important concepts, because as we move forward in society, the chasm between these 2 things gets larger and larger. The gap between what the media is telling us real Canadians think and what real Canadians actually think. And this is such an important idea because we are, contrary to our criticisms of the mainstream media, still as a society and as a country shaped by that very media. And we can't get lured into this false sense of security that everyone has the same level of trust and deference to them that we do. People still in this country rely on that old school mentality that if it's on CBC, it's true. No, Danny didn't bring a stand-up comedian. People actually think that sometimes. There is a resistance to independent voices. And this is something that I learned firsthand. I was covering the election campaign, or trying to, in the midst of very adverse circumstances. One of the hallmarks of the 2019 election campaign was that the government decided in its very, very finite wisdom that the government should be responsible for organizing leaders' debates, because the media had been doing it and the government thought we can do it better, which is always a recipe for success. And it actually ended up being very positive for illuminating a problem that I've been trying to illuminate in Canada for quite some time, which is the government's resistance to people that are outside the bubble. The Leaders' Debates Commission is the body that was created. Appointed at the head of it was former Governor General David Johnston. This was the bureaucracy that was to determine who is worthy of appearing on a debate stage, and by extension, we learned during the campaign who is worthy of practicing as a journalist in Canada, who's worthy of covering the government-run leaders' debate. The day that the portal for applying for media accreditation opened, I put together my application and submitted it the next day. It asked for a number of things. It asked for your outlet, it asked for your journalism credentials, which is a particularly unique question in a country that has no such thing as journalism credentials, as some things you read would illustrate. And what happened was we put it through, and for I think 10 days didn't hear anything. On October 4th, the Friday before the Monday debate, I get a 2-sentence email saying that my request for accreditation has been declined because my outlet, tnc.news, engages in advocacy. Now, there are 2 problems with this. Number one, True North, as a charitable organization does not engage in advocacy. And the second, even if it did, who cares? The Toronto Star on its website has very proudly a mandate for, quote, advocating for social and economic justice, unquote. The Toronto Star was granted accreditation. True North and Rebel News were denied accreditation for the same criteria, engaging in advocacy. So we took the government to court. The debate was on Monday, October 7th. At 9 a.m., my colleague Candace Malcolm, a lawyer, showed up at federal court in Toronto and found a judge to take the case. After a 90-minute hearing, the judge deliberated very briefly, came back, and ordered the Leaders Debates Commission to grant accreditation to Rebel and to True North. Thank you. Thank you. It was a great day for freedom. I was holed up in a hotel room in Ottawa at the ready to go to the debate. Admittedly, about 10 minutes in, I wanted to sue to get out, but that's besides the point. The judge just yesterday released the written decision in which the government was eviscerated. I want to read a section from Justice Zinn's decision. I find that the decisions are lacking in discernible rationality and logic, and thus are neither justified nor intelligible. Now, that sounds like a boilerplate analysis of the Liberal platform, but this was specific to the Leaders Debates Commission's decision to exclude journalists for no other reason than they aren't like every other journalist in Canada. This came after the Liberal Party of Canada had denied me access to its own events, after police pulled me over for following the Liberal campaign to a campaign event, after police had me ejected from a public rally at the direction of a Liberal organizer, all for practicing the crime of unsanctioned journalism by the Liberals, which is code for I'm not getting some of the $600 million. One of the things that, I hope you're applauding at not getting it, by the way, or a lone CBC reporter made their way in. This talk is called Meeting the Challenge, or this event, Meeting the Challenge of Western Separation. I want to talk about the challenges in discussing narratives that deviate from the official narratives of the mainstream media and of the government. Margaret Thatcher has famously said that first you win the argument, then you win the vote. Andrew Breitbart, before he passed away, had coined the phrase, politics is downstream of culture. As conservatives, and I think as Canadians in general, we tend to have too much deference to the outcome of elections when all of us can look by and see that society itself is not really changing. Or if it is, it's not going in the direction that we want to push it. To talk about any public policy issue, you have to be prepared to break through that bubble. And as I said earlier, we can discount the mainstream media's power, but we have to understand there is in fact a power. And a lot of the time, this is wielded in very subtle ways. I'll give a couple of examples. The Huffington Post wrote about the True North case against the Leaders Debates Commission. And throughout the article was the designation, the far-right True North. Now, everyone in this room has seen in some way the media cast that label, but what they're doing is they're discounting without any basis. There's no definition of far-right. At what point does right become far-right? Now, to a lot of people in the media, anyone who believes anything to the right of them is far-right, but that's precisely the problem. We pushed back against that branding and got a correction, to the Huffington Post credit, and I'm grateful for that. I ran for office in Ontario a year and a half ago, and there was a news story about me that I want to read 3 sentences of, because again, you hear the wording that is used to brand people. In one corner is Andrew Lawton, the controversial former radio host turned Politico. Lawton is progressive conservative leader Doug Ford's controversial pick for the riding. He's remained controversy-free during the campaign. So that was, and the story was only about 6 paragraphs long, so I got 3 shout-outs to the word controversy, the last of which was conceding there was no controversy, but by that time I've already been branded 2-1 as controversial. Now again, I don't shy away from that designation, but this is the way the media chooses to define and by extension malign. And they have success in doing this. So I want to address why this narrative thrives. And to do this, I hadn't planned to make this comment, but I have to, having been at this conference for the last several hours. Where is the mainstream media right now in this room? I'm looking for a hand to go up and I don't see one. Well, I don't think the rebel would embrace mainstream, and I think mainstream is not a compliment in this particular context. Here we have hundreds of people discussing an issue that matters to all Albertans, that matters to Canadians. The mainstream media is not here. And if they are, not in the large numbers they were for a Greta Thunberg rally. So the reason this is important is because there is an Eastern focus to the media, and an Eastern focus that we've heard talked about as the Laurentian effect. And I'll explain a little bit about where that comes from. When the Liberals had denied me accreditation to cover their campaign, they created these hurdles that didn't exist. They said, well, you're not an accredited news organization. Accreditation is handed out by the organization from whom you're seeking accreditation. So the Liberals were invoking this self-fulfilling prophecy. You're not accredited because we haven't accredited you. Despite the fact that the Bloc Québécois had accredited me, the NDP had accredited me, the Conservative Party, the PPC had accredited me. I had been accredited by the Republican and Democratic parties, by the governments of Canada and the UK, but for the Liberal Party, I was not a real journalist, which by their definition is probably a great compliment. However, I wanted to do my job. I wanted to cover the campaign. They said, in order to be considered, you must be a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. This is the organization that the Debates Commission had outsourced its accreditation process to in some way, a way that we're still hoping to find out through the courts. We reached out to the PPG and said, how can we get accredited to cover this national campaign? Here was what they told us. To receive a full-time accreditation, you must be based in Ottawa and work from Ottawa full-time. The House of Commons approach to media is that you have to literally be in a radius of a few square kilometers to have the privilege of covering the government. This is a problem that we're up against. When you read media stories that are biased, that don't make sense, what you're actually seeing is the product of a bubble, the media party, as we've heard it called. And this goes back to journalism schools in many respects. Selena Zito is a Harvard lecturer and the founder of something called the Main Street Project. She's also a New York Post columnist who wrote about an experiment she did with a number of her students at Harvard, undergrad students, 19, 20, 21 years old. She took them to a town called Chicopee, Massachusetts, which is 90 miles west of Harvard. Small town America, none of the students had ever been there. They met with the police chief, they met with the mayor, they met with small business owners, with waitresses, with firefighters. They went to the diner where everyone knew everyone's name. They went to a gun range and saw that, oh my goodness, women fire guns. They had this experience they had never had before. They went into a Catholic church. 2 of them had been to one before. 24% of the USA identifies as Catholic. Every student in the class was from a coastal state. In reality, 39% of Americans live in coastal states. Their eyes widened when they learned that all of these lovely, nice, small-town people they met came from a town that Donald Trump won with an overwhelming margin. Most of them had never met a Trump voter and had no idea in their mind that they could like one. These are people that are the next crop of journalists. My personal favorite, and I'll speak to the Albertans in the room here, only 1 student in the class had ever fired a gun. 70% of Americans have fired a gun. I'm guessing more people in this room have fired a gun today than the people in that class in their lifetime. Did anyone fire a gun this morning? All right, I see 1 hand up, all right. But this is the reality. I worked in a newsroom where at one time a story was published that I had no role in, I assure you, that was talking about police having seized a bolt-action semi-automatic assault rifle. I told that in Ontario and no one got it. That's true. That was true. What happened was the police sent out a release that had a factual error in it. A bolt-action semi-automatic assault rifle was seized. A reporter looks at it and unquestionably says, okay, I guess it's bolt-action semi-automatic and an assault rifle. Having no way to know better because you have an industry that is dominated by people who have had limited experiences. Now, there are two problems here. You can chalk up these things to incompetence, or you can chalk it up to malice. You can't fault people for things they've never been told. You can, when faced with the truth and faced with the facts, they still continue to ignore it. I went through with a firearms group the process of trying to invite journalists to go to a trip at the gun range. Several said, you know what, that would be a good experience. Some said, nope, I don't like guns, I don't want to see guns, I don't want to touch guns. Who do you think are the most likely to make significant errors when these things come up? People that have an opportunity to broaden their horizons and choose not to. Now, the stats that I mentioned are American ones, but the trend is very similar in Canada. The type of people that go into journalism programs and go into journalism come from cities. They come from liberal arts programs. They oftentimes come from families that have connections to the industry. You see a lot of heredity to journalism. It's probably one of the most unpleasant genetic conditions you can have. I say this as someone working in media. They do not represent the diversity of Canada. Isn't diversity supposed to be our strength? It is, unless you're talking about incorporating conservative perspectives, reaching out to people of different faith backgrounds, and yes, Germaine to the conference here, reaching out to people from the West. There are two Canadas. We saw this very markedly in the last couple of weeks. There's a fellow you may have heard of, his name's Don Cherry. And he went through a bit of an ordeal where if you defined your entire perspective of him based on the media, you would think he was the worst person in the world. You take some time to talk to an ordinary person and perhaps you learn that he's actually an all right guy. We have allowed this siloing to occur. We see this with social conservative perspectives. We see it with Western perspectives. We see it in any number of ways. It's important to break through this. The reason you need to do it is for what I've just said. You are never going to win an election that it matters if you can't move the needle on these cultural issues and breaking through to an audience. I don't want to come just with problems. As I close, I have a few solutions. Number one, support independent media. If you've ever complained about media bias and canceled a subscription to a paper or said, I'm not going to watch this network, what have you done to provide a positive alternative? This means donating, it means viewing, it means sharing, it means not being afraid to go up when your friends on Facebook say, how can you like X? How can you like Y? You have to support people who tell the truth. Don't stand for factual errors and biases. Don't stand for inaccurate malignment of your cause or your individuality. And do not stand for people telling you from a little office in Ottawa that your perspective doesn't matter. Thank you. The one axiom that I will close with here: when facts are on your side, truth will win. Thank you and God bless.
Well, there was a lot of wisdom in that stand-up comedy. That was a pretty good comedian we brought in. Thank you very much, Andrew. He said, like, truth will be on your side. Mark Twain also said that. He said the surest way to win an argument is to start on the right side of it. And I think we're on the right side of this. And I know we've all had a busy day, but now we're going to get to hear from one of my favorite ex-politicians. I call him an old-fashioned politician because he actually remembered me when I needed something. As you know, there's a whole host of politicians in the world who tell you they're their best friend until they get elected, and then they look at you like they can't remember who you are. You know what I mean? So anyway,